Hi, I'm Steve Hassan, and I'm delighted to have a colleague and friend, Chris Lee, with me on this interview. Chris, we go back many, many years.
Yeah, something like 23, I believe, 24
Yeah,
years.
and a group that I've written about in combating cult mind control is Kip McKean's Boston Church of Christ that has changed a number of names. And I believe we met in the context of your own affiliation or disaffiliation from that. Would you share with our viewers a little bit of your background and history, and we can go from there?
Sure, I would describe myself as not necessarily being born into or growing up in a Christian family. Uh, I had no idea of Christian doctrine when I was growing up, and my best friend in high school kind of educated me a little bit here and there, but I would not describe myself as a Christian. I think I came to the conclusion that I believed in God, I believed in the Creator, and was kind of convinced, okay, I'll get my life together first. I'll go off and get my education. I got accepted to MIT, and it was a great opportunity. Ironically, my best friend, who was Christian, kind of warned me, oh, you're off to Boston. Let me warn you about this one group that is extremely aggressive in recruiting people, and they have a lot of bad beliefs. It's the Boston Church of Christ. And, unfortunately, ironically, I didn't listen to him. And my first year at MIT, I decided, oh, this Christianity stuff is too confusing. There's all these different denominations. I don't know exactly what to do. And I decided, oh, there's all these opportunities at MIT. I'm going to go, check out sports, or I'm going to check out this interest, or I'm going to work for the newspaper, or, other things. And it was in my sophomore year that some friends had gotten involved with the Boston Church of Christ. And through our friendship, we were members of the MIT Symphony Orchestra. They said, hey, Chris, we're having a movie night on Friday night. This was 1991. So Kevin Costner's Dances with Wolves had just come out. And certainly it's a movie about a guy who thinks he's, a soldier and goes out and kind of finds himself and,
Right. I
discovers
remember
his
the
identity.
movie.
And so they kind of use that as a talking point. Have you ever gone out and found yourself, discovered what you really want? And kind of at that point in time, it was a good timing that I had been thinking more about these things. I'd been getting straight A's at MIT. I'd won a freshman bridge building contest. And it seemed like everything was on the up and up for me, but it seemed like there's got to be more. And I started thinking about some of those bigger questions and maybe a little bit more about faith and Christianity. And so I was open to discussing Christianity with my friends. And, sure, I said, let's talk about it. And, I do believe I should read the Bible more. And they were more than happy to engage me. I didn't expect them to jump into it right away. It was immediately scheduled for the next day. And for like the next 9 to 10 days, I studied every day. It was, an hour and a half, 2 hours, 3 hours at a time. And the next study was scheduled as soon as the last one was completed. And I felt very rushed at the time, but I was like, well, I'm interested in this. And, they're also interested in helping me. So maybe this is a good thing. And, didn't know any better
Yeah,
at
and
the
I think
time.
you wanted to be a rocket scientist, and you were probably used to cramming and getting a lot of information in a short period of time, would be my guess.
Yeah. But certainly like I didn't expect the Bible studies to go as quickly as they did.
Mhm.
And but I was kind of like, well, we'll go with the flow, and they
Mhm.
think it's important, and I kind of would like this. So um, I think if I had my druthers, I would have said, look, let's slow down a little bit. I need some time to think about this and process. But it's kind of like push through. And even towards the end, they were like, oh, do you want to get baptized? Their big
Right,
thing is to become a member, to be initiated, you have to be baptized.
right.
And I was kind of like, well, when you think I'm ready, then I'm sure it'll be high time. And they're like, no, you have to be very determined that you want this. You're not eager enough. So we did a few studies at the end, and they were like, how much do you want this? And so I was baptized, initiated to their church on November 18th, 1991.
Mm-hmm.
My first study was 9 days before that. It was, Monday night that I was baptized. My first study was on a Saturday, 9 days before that. And the studies went extremely quickly, and it was definitely a whirlwind. And kind of immediately, my friends who were Christians in other groups, so InterVarsity was a healthy Christian parachurch organization, and I had friends who were that, and they were like, oh, whoa, we see Chris has suddenly gotten involved because he's hanging around with the Boston Church of Christ people. And they gave me some literature. It was, back in the day, it was photocopies of news articles and things like that.
Right.
And I kind of got scared a little bit at first and was like, what have I gotten myself into? I thought that if I watched carefully but didn't tell people that I was watching, that I would be able to detect if the abuse was happening.
Mm-hmm.
But only afterwards I realized they're not going to tell me. It's kind of on a need to know basis. And even if I was looking for it, it's kind of done away from me that I wouldn't be able to detect it.
Right.
So
I had heard of this group back in the early 80s. And just to interrupt, if I may, and just say Kip McKean was kind of the head of this very pyramid structured, discipling focused cult group. I would call it an authoritarian cult. And very much books like The Master Plan of Evangelism that I remember they using in the early days were like, well, communism uses brainwashing. We need one for Jesus. We need to brainwash people for Jesus, is my recollection. And but really, people don't find out that their baptisms in other churches were not legitimate. Only the Boston movement, later the International Churches of Christ. And I also want to just say, and then I'll get back to you, is that there's a mainline Church of Christ that's been around for many, many years, have millions of followers, and they were heavily infiltrated in the early days by this cult group that was dividing churches until they kind of realized, oh my goodness, they're teaching non-biblical practices to manipulate, to deceive, to pressure people. And that's where the cult connection came in. So back to your story.
Yeah, so when I'll weave into some of those elements too. So after I studied like 6-7 months and didn't see the abuses that were described in the papers, I was like, okay, I'm firmly committed to this. And I threw myself, I recruited a couple of people that I still, regret to this day, and started rising in the ranks as a leader. I was an assistant Bible talk leader and later a Bible talk leader. And then I started noticing that there were little, things that could be improved. I said they could be improved. It wasn't like, this is wrong, this is unbiblical, we need to change it. But it was more like, there's lots of little things, such as, I feel like we're always constantly being pushed to recruit. And those are the types of questions that we tend to ask each other. Did you, cold contact evangelize? Did you, invite your visitors to this event or that event? And it was never things like, or hardly ever things like, hey, are you stressed? Are you, upset about anything? You have enough time to do your laundry? Can I help you in any way? You on top of your homework? You burned out, or anything of those, kind of normal questions. It was always like, did you have your quiet time? Did you invite your visitor for this event or that event? And there were a lot of things.
Fill out an accountability sheet where you had to report everything you did all day, and explain about having a discipleship partner or somebody over you, and how that structure works, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so normally you're assigned somebody who is slightly ahead of you in leadership. So if you're, a non-leader, a laity, they were also nicknamed rank and file after they left, but you're a non-leader, you're assigned somebody who's usually like an assistant Bible talk leader or Bible talk leader, if you're a Bible talk leader, you're assigned something like a family group leader or zone leader. Since we were part of like the MIT Harvard Tufts Metro Campus Ministry, we actually reported to Kip McKean's brother, Randy McKean. And so he met with us fairly regularly. And there's definitely, as you said, that pyramidal structure, reported all the way up to the top to Kip. Kip made all the, master decisions.
Yeah, I have a little
Exactly.
graphic to it.
Exactly. And there's definitely like the information goes upwards and the control comes downwards, and there's very little accountability at the top.
Yeah.
There's no way for me to disbar the people at the top or really question if they're doing the right thing or things like
Right.
that. And as I wrote about these issues and brought them up, and I was like, well, maybe I'm hallucinating, maybe I'm just imagining things that are there. So I passed around my papers, and my friends or the people who were members said, hey, you're not seeing things, we see these things too, and it concerns us as well, but we didn't think that we were spiritual enough. You're always made to feel like you're unspiritual for bringing up anything to change the church, improve the church. This is, perfect as far as they're concerned.
Right. This is God's way, right? So who are you sinner?
Right. You're unspiritual. You're not enlightened. And then, it's always like your problem. There's definitely that ad hominem as opposed to really addressing the issues.
Right.
And also, I had maintained my friendships with people who are Christians. I deemed them as Christians outside the Boston Church of Christ. And I said, hey, I noticed you guys outside of our group working really well together. It's like, the 17 groups, how do you do it? And why aren't we part of this? And they said, well, it comes down to this. You don't think we're Christians. You don't want to work with us, or your church doesn't. And I said, no, I think you're Christians. And they said, well, why don't you get some of your leaders and we'll get some of our leaders. And we had a 3-hour talk. This guy, Jim Ryan, has since left the group and since, called me up and apologized and said, I treated you wrong. And, now I've seen the light and I've seen how abusive this church is and how wrong their doctrine is, and a number of their other, abuses in terms of finances and things like that. But Jim at that time more or less dismissed the other 3, non-Boston Church of Christ leaders and said, you got baptized when you're a kid. Well, that's invalid. And, you didn't have the right beliefs because of your baptism. Like, you have to have our beliefs that baptism right. literally saves you. And, you weren't baptized into a discipling church. Therefore, your baptism is not valid. You're not a Christian. And the 3, non-Boston Church of Christ leaders looked at each other and said, okay, we've found out what we need to know. Thank you for your time. And that was the end of that meeting. And it got back that I had orchestrated it. So supposedly I was very naughty for both passing around a paper daring to improve the church, as well as orchestrating a meeting with people and not going with the party line, because the right. Boston Church of Christ literally does not believe there are Christians outside of their group. They will not.
That's a characteristic of all authoritarian cults, as they say. You can only be saved if you follow our group.
Yeah, and especially they, as with other authoritarian groups, they might phrase it like, well, we have this unique insight or special knowledge that God has given our leaders or our, members. And it might be more subtle, and that might not be like that, they're saved and, the members are saved and non-members are not. It might be, we're more enlightened than the average Christian. I had to work with a lady who was involved with what's known as local church or small flock.
Oh, Witness Lee?
Yeah, Witness Lee's group, very good.
Right.
And very much her boyfriend was a Christian, very devout guy, serious in his faith, but they were trying to split them up. The members of and the leaders of the local church in Cambridge was trying to split them up because, he's not a member. He's not as enlightened as us. He doesn't have the full truth.
Right, exactly. So I want to just, in the interest of time, say that you left the group, and not only did you leave the group, but I believe you went to seminary, because you wanted to get training, like
Yeah,
accredited training on
yeah. So there,
what the Bible teaches, right?
yeah, absolutely. So kind of through my own recovery, a lot of the materials weren't there at this point in time, and it made me sensitized to those things. I had good Christian friends who kind of said, like, you know, you can steer people away from the Boston Church of Christ, but what if they are eagerly desirous of, you know, knowledge about Christianity? How are you going to provide them alternatives? And I realized, you know, I should be aware of what good Christianity believes, and I had come to the point that I agreed that I was a Christian and I wanted to be a Christian. So I went to seminary, started in 1998, did it part-time while working in high tech full-time. I did a Gordon Conwell, which is non-denominational. And because as part of the Boston Theological Institute, I can take some different classes at other
Right.
institutions where I got to experience some Greek Orthodox and Roman Catholic classes as well. And, you know, every class kind of helped me realize, like, whoa, this is, you know, what good Christianity teaches. And this is why the Boston Church of Christ and the International Church of Christ, the International Christian Church, is actually wrong. Some of it was psychological and realizing some of the tactics that they were using to
Yep.
lock people in and, you know, keep people from realizing the truth. Some of it was, you know, wrong history, wrong understanding of the scriptures and things like that. I've, you know, mentioned to you indirectly that you know, there's two major ways that we can read the Bible. We can try to, you know, understand from the text, kind of grab,
Exegesis.
yeah, exegesis, you know, trying to understand like the culture and the history and the words, understanding it in context. I was just flipping through my daughter's copy of, you know, Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, and they talk about flying cars. And, you know, if you just grab that one sentence, you could say, oh, Harry Potter is about flying cars, but obviously it's not. It's about, you know, a boy who's going to magic school. And so it's very clear that you can rip passages out of the Bible and support all kinds of weird doctrines, uh, including if we, you know, assembled random scriptures together, things like, you know, Judas went and hanged himself, go and do likewise, and whatever you're about to do quickly seems to support suicide, you know, right now.
Yeah, my former cult, the Moonies, were into God lies, because we see, how biblical figures have not, done been completely honest, but it's taken out of context. And I guess I want to emphasize for people who are listening for the first time, the influence continuum. And what we're talking about with legitimate Christianity is informed consent, and the right to question, and the right to talk to whoever you want to talk to and think for yourself and follow your conscience, versus dependence and obedience to some human who says they know the truth and manipulates and controls you through fear and tells you who you can and can't talk to. So there are real core behavioral, problems and issues.
Absolutely.
Is my memory correct, Chris, that you were going to be a rocket scientist, but because of the cult involvement, it kind of derailed you a bit, or am I
Yeah,
not?
I mean, so my grades started dropping significantly after my involvement with the Boston Church of Christ. And I realized after I left, it was all the number of hours that I was spending in meetings. When I first left the first month, I realized, like, where did all this free time come from? And then I was like, oh, let's write down every single meeting I had to go through. And merely as a member, I had to do 12 hours a week, excluding travel time.
Mhm.
And it became more when I was a leader, and leaders can easily sink in 30, 40 hours a week. My grades were plummeting so much that I started getting incompletes and fails. And fortunately, the dean of MIT, his roommate was one of the world sector leaders, Al Baird. So Robert Randolph kind of took me aside, and at that time he said, Chris, I think you have a lot more academic potential than this, and I hate to see you wasting your parents' money and your academic potential. You should take some time off. And if you're really serious about your faith, you should study the scriptures, learn some Greek and Hebrew, learn some theology, read some church history, And kind of ironically, after I left, I went up to Dean Randolph and I said, hey, I'd like you to write my academic recommendation for seminary. So he happily did that, and that
Okay.
set me on that track.
Good, good. So we have so much more to cover. I just want to give kudos to you that you went on to help be a webmaster of reveal.org and assemble a lot of resources to help other people who've been not only in this particular Bible cult, but to help others to understand real significant problems and issues, right?
Sure. So yeah, I got involved, as it's very much grassroots, which is kind of interesting. It's never been a top-down thing where a group of us just kind of met and we said, hey, this information is not available. We'd love to have had it. And we started putting together all these things. And then people started coming to us saying, hey, my city just had, a runaway church, like the Indianapolis church. And they came to us, and then Milan, and certainly Dave Medrano, who headed up Lisbon and Madrid, came to us. Henry Crete, when he wrote his letter, that letter wasn't up on any major church website.
Henry is a former leader in the group who left and
Yeah.
named a lot of the problems, right?
Right. This is a major city evangelist. He's it's pretty much like the second in command in London. And he said, wrote this 50-page treatise that was basically like, okay, there's lots of legalism, there's lots of problems. And he helped
Explain
to.
legalism before we go further, please.
Sure. Legalism is largely where you add to requirements and make it so burdensome. So for example, if you feel like there's a checklist of things that you have to do, it's the do's and don'ts of Christianity. You have to pray or else you're not in good standing with God, or you have to share your faith, or you have to, go and recruit some people, or any of these things
Or
that
if
are.
you have a beard, you
Yep,
might be
having a
in a
beard or
cult that
not having a
says,
beard. Yeah.
wait a minute, Jesus had a beard, maybe, oh, well, let's, but it's extra requirements,
Right.
behavioral requirements to induce conformity is how I think about it.
Right. And it's an arbitrary list too. We could, look at other lists in the Bible, and it seems like, you know, I guess the theological word is shibboleths. And, there's like the list of things that we think as a group is important. And it could be this list of things versus a different group could have a different list of things.
Right.
Unfortunately, very arbitrary.
Right. So I also want to just emphasize my understanding of legitimate Christianity is it's very based on love and not on fear. God is almighty, not Satan. But in these authoritarian groups, there's so much fear.
Yeah, definitely a lot of fear and phobias, locking you in, and especially like interplaying with all that are like Lifton's criteria. So, the there's a lot of sense of like,
Lifton was studied brainwashing in China in the 50s, for those who have not
right. Yeah,
familiar.
so Lifton's a fascinating character study because he's looking at POWs, prisoners of war, who are obviously they were very patriotic. They were willing to lay down their lives at some point in time, but somehow changed over the course of their lives to the point that they were like now down with America and burn the flag. And Lifton was like, oh, that's very curious how they changed. And what are the factors necessary to cause this change? So he developed his criteria, a series of 8 things, one of which is kind of like, if you leave, you're no longer in existence. You're not a person. And
Exactly.
for example, for us in the Boston Church of Christ, we'd call them fallaways. You fell away from God. You're no longer in God's good graces.
Yeah, Walking Dead and The Fallen and all kinds of other loaded terms are used and such. We recently reconnected because of infiltration on college campuses of your former group. What is it being called nowadays? What names are they going by?
So the groups have been going by lots of different things, unfortunately. So around 2005, 2006, Kip McKean kind of split off again from the International Church of Christ after he kind of determined that everybody should unite under his vision, and a number of their leaders said, no, 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 we don't like that. And so there was a schism again in that 2005, 2006 timeframe. And his group is, I forget what they're called. Some of them are like Cornerstone. Sometimes it's Alpha and Omega. They go under
Different front
very,
groups.
yeah, they're not very suspicious. They seem like they're kind of normal, but you really have to dig in. I had to talk to a guy who was a failed recruit. This is actually a positive term, but a guy who was attempted to be recruited in, but he did not join their group, and he had to do some digging. So he was out in UMass Amherst, and there that campus I think is called Cornerstone. So it's like Cornerstone Christian Ministry, and he didn't really figure out that this was part of the International Church of Christ until he did a lot more digging and finding out, like, what churches are you trying to invite me to, and what are they associated with. They sometimes masquerade as a non-denominational church.
Absolutely. Deception is huge. And I don't know what your advice is, but I always tell people you have to ask very direct questions and be very alert if they deflect or change the subject or whatever. And just keep really asking, well, who started it? Who is in charge? Who's in charge of the bank accounts? Where, and if they say, I don't know, then you say you're asking for money, but you don't know where the money's going. I'm not going to give unless I see the books. Because if it's a legitimate nonprofit, you should be able to see the accounting records.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And my experience has been in a normal, healthy church, they don't push you for money either. So, for example, in my church, I've told stories about this. It's been, very heartwarming. In years that there's downturns of economy, they've said, we're going to, tighten our belts. We're going to not have budget expansion. We're going to be more careful. We're not going to put more missionaries in the fields. We're going to tighten up on programs. We understand you're in a world of hurt, just like, and just as we are. We don't want to impose more burden on you. There's been times where they've said, college students and graduate students, you're in debt and you don't have a real job. Please highly consider being wise with your money. And we love that you're being generous, and we appreciate that. But, please don't feel any compulsion to give. And there's been services where we've allowed people who needed it to take money instead of, putting in money. And at those services, the giving actually has been higher. In years that there's financial downturn for whatever reasons.
You're talking about legitimate church? Yeah. Okay. I just want to make sure. It didn't sound like the cult group at all.
Right. The legitimate churches, exactly. They're not monitoring giving. I've never had somebody in nearly 23 years of being a member of this church now. Nobody has ever knocked on my door and said, hey, you need to give more, or we notice you're not giving any, or things like that. It's always been, it's up to you, please be wise, and they leave it at that.
Chris, if I may just switch for 1 minute and just ask for your comment as a Christian, as someone who, you have a master's in theology from
Master in Divinity. So it's actually a pastor's degree. Yeah.
Pastor's degree, cool. What do you say to people who say we're living in the end times? We any moment the judgment day is coming. And also, what do you say to people who say, you should put a contribution on your credit card, even though you have no money? God's going to bless you 10 times if you give the donation or the tithe to our church. What do you have to say about that?
Sure. So there's two different issues. So the end times, I would say, first, we've been in the end times for roughly the last 2,000 years, and Jesus hasn't returned yet. As soon as Jesus ascended, we've been in the end times. That's what the biblical understanding is. Yep. And while we're in these end times, God still expects us to be good stewards of what he's given, whether that's the creation, whether that's friends, whether that's money. We're not supposed to neglect these things, even our own bodies. Like, I take care of my health. I think that's important. I don't, binge on alcohol or binge on video games or whatever it is,
Uh-huh.
and there's things that I take care of, my family and things like that. Even if we're in the end times, and I think Jesus is returning at some point in time, I'm still acting like, hey, God's left me in charge of these things. I got to be careful. To the financial aspects.
Can I interrupt and just say, am I misremembering that the scripture says if somebody says the Lord has come here or there, don't listen to them? Am I misremembering a verse?
Yeah, so you are not. That is correct. So we also, it's the Spirit blows wherever He wants, and we have no control over the Holy Spirit as well. So God can go wherever He wants. But yes, you're remembering correctly. The financial piece, it's very unwise. So it gets into legalism again. So there's 5 levels of command in the Bible. It's absolutely commanded. In other words, it's not a suggestion. So forgiving somebody is not a divine suggestion. Then it is wise to do something. The Bible is neutral, which is a lot of things. So should you buy a Honda Civic, or should you buy a Corolla? The Bible's neutral about those things. So you're supposed to apply some biblical principles and be wise. Is it should I have white chicken chili for lunch, or should I have soup for lunch? Well, the Bible's also neutral about that. Then there's the 4th level is unwise. So getting into debt is generally considered unwise. We can explore that a little bit. And then the last one it's forbidden. So there's a number of the 10 commandments where it says, you shall have no other God, you shall not take the Lord's name in vain, you shall, not covet, you shall not steal, you shall not murder, things like that. Those are forbidden.
Right.
So what legalism tends to do is it either, switches levels. So it basically says, what the Bible is either neutral about is now forbidden, or, what I think is wise to do is suddenly a command. And in regarding debt is actually unwise. So what I mean by unwise is generally you shouldn't get into debt. It's a bad idea unless you have very good plans about what to do with that debt. So for example, if you get a mortgage, which is a form of debt, you should be wise about it. You should think about, what are my budgetary requirements? What do I absolutely need in a house? And you've kind of thought through those things, as well as student loans. That's another form of debt. And so it's generally you've thought through it very carefully. You maybe sought some wise counsel. Maybe you see a financial counselor, you see a banker, and you talk about it. You talk to your real estate agent, and really determine what you must have versus what you would like. And you've formulated a plan about how you're going to repay these things. So, you don't go into education and think, well, I hope I get a job in 4 years' time. I'll study something that's just got no marketable value.
Well, let's cut to the chase. There are people who are prosperity gospel people who are just really pressuring people to give money, and they're being told they'll be blessed tenfold if they put contributions on credit card and other things. What I hear you saying is, no, this is not.
No, this is terrible idea. Don't do it. I don't see the thing is that the Bible doesn't promise anything in terms of financial prosperity, and including, and it's terribly unwise to put any amounts of money on credit cards,
Anyway.
Especially if you have no plan to pay it back or no ability to pay it back.
Right, but I mean, I've been doing some cases with doomsday prepper groups that are like, well, the world's coming to an end, so it doesn't matter. I can just charge up supplies, fill up my tent with briquettes and with stored food, because we're going to have this terrible thing happen. Mm-hmm. And it's but they're being represented or misrepresented in the media as evangelical Christians, and my friends like yourself who are evangelical Christians are like, this is not what the Bible is teaching.
No, it's not the Bible's teaching. certainly
Yeah,
are.
good. I'm really glad to hear you say that. And what about dominionists, people who think we need to control the government for Jesus?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole uh, series of thought in that. And one thing that I point to is the Puritans. So, when the initial settlers came to our part of the world, Massachusetts, they tried to set up what they thought was government under God, otherwise known as theocracy.
Hmm.
And now we can look back and say it's a failed experiment. It's terrible. It's because we can't control people through laws. And that, uh, certainly if we look at the Puritan experiment, they were trying to model all their laws as God's laws. And I don't think that was, the best thing. A number of people rebelled against it. They didn't think through all the consequences. So they got into all kinds of weird scenarios.
Yeah, and the
Um,
founding fathers expressly said we need separation of church and state. We want freedom of religion.
sure.
It's really important because what I'm seeing is a lot of the power players in the last 4 years in our country's politics really believe that God wants to take over the country and have America as a Christian country, and to basically, harass and persecute anyone who isn't of their ilk, even though their ilk is not even Christianity, at least
Sure.
legitimate Christianity.
See, I think what would be more healthy would be something like, we're convinced of certain principles and we'll more come to the table and talk it out and persuade you of things. So, certain things like everybody has some idea of morality. So if I think that it's wrong to litter on the highway while going 65 miles an hour, there are laws, right? That is one kind of morality. I think it's wrong to throw garbage out my window when, I'm traveling on the highway. And likewise, I could also say, it's also moral to talk about not setting off forest fires, because that obviously destroys the environment and causes all kinds of air pollution. But it's also, other types of morality are being discussed. Obviously, things like stolen property or destruction of property is, a moral question. We have laws about those things. But certainly I think it'd be better if we kind of came to the table and said, hey, these are my views and this is what I think is important and this is why, and kind of hashed it out.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. It's not what's happening right now. And so let's jump into your recommendations if the group is recruiting in your neighborhood or at your college. What have you found works and what doesn't work in terms of strategy or how to expose them or
Sure. So first off, like a lot of these groups, they tend to be very high pressure, and it's almost like, so my brother, unfortunately, I won't name him, but he was into at one point in time these high pressure sales, and I could see a lot of these tactics. And it's like that used cars dealer. Oh, I've got this great bargain. It's only $4,000, but I've got three other people looking at the car. I need you to make a decision in the next 30 minutes. And if it's worth anything, if it's not a lemon, you should be able to say, hey, I'd like to take it to a mechanic, like to check it out. I want some time to think about it and to look it over. And a lot of those should also go into evaluating a campus ministry or a church or things like that. Like,
yeah.
can we step back a moment? We don't want to rush into this decision. It seems like a pretty significant one. And legitimate churches will say, okay, sure. If you want to talk to whoever, have at it. And I've talked to former members of my church. I have friends who are former members of my church. We talk about things, and there's good reasons why they're not members.
When
Or
you say my church, you mean the Boston Church of Christ, or are you
no, no.
talking about your
So,
current
so my
church?
current church is Park Street Church, and
Okay.
so there's a bunch of friends of mine who are former members of the Park Street Church. Some
Okay.
of them it's because it's far away. Other ones of them because it's their choice and whatever else. And we maintain our friendships, and we're able to discuss like, okay, these are the good and bad things. But I'd encourage that even if you are evaluating a church or evaluating a campus ministry, like if they're trying to rush you, slow down, put on the brakes,
Right.
check it out, look around for literature on it, try to figure out what's, and obviously there might be some exaggerations, but there might be some nuggets of truth. And you should be able to talk to people and say like, hey, I'd just like to know what your experience is, and why did you leave, or why are you no longer a member? And you can also see by the way that they process things. So some people who are more thoughtful will obviously indicate good reasons and things like that. Um, then there might be, especially with cults, they will not allow you to talk to their former members, and when you do, you'll see that there might be a lot of embarrassment or things like that, like
Well, cults will always put down former members because in their mind, there's no legitimate reason to leave their group
right.
because they're so convinced that it's true. At the risk of a shameless plug, I found when people bring up this book,
Yeah,
legitimate churches are like, "Oh, cool," and cults are like, you know,
yeah, absolutely.
they don't want to talk about it. They don't want to have a discussion about it at all. They'll say bad things about me, you
Yeah,
know.
I mean, there's definitely a lot of character assassination of the messenger. So, there's been numerous people who have tried to bring criticisms who are former members. When I first left, they used to say like, "Oh, he did this and that," and then it didn't stick, because like
Right.
the worst
Oh,
thing that they got me for was like lying or something. It was like white lies, and then just became dismissal, like he got in too fast too soon, and he had a bad experience.
yeah. And it's basically an ad hominem attack that there's something wrong with you and nothing wrong with the group.
Yeah,
Or the group might say, oh, we've changed. That's another thing. And again, you need to look at very concrete behaviors if there really is change. Um, but say something about your point of view on freedom for groups to exist as clubs on college campuses.
sure, there's two major schools of thought on that. So there's so when I was a student, and so I returned back to MIT, um, Bob Randolph was in favor, and he was definitely the minority view. So he said, if we ban them, we know they're going to exist anyways. They're going to have their studies just slightly off campus. They'll go across the street and go to the Starbucks, and they'll go to whatever the restaurant is across the street, and they'll hold their studies anyways. And we'd rather know that they're there. We've discussed this, or I've discussed this as a member of Reveal with parachurch organizations and churches, and they agree. They see that too. As soon as you ban the group off campus, they just conveniently locate themselves at the Starbucks across the street.
Yeah, they go underground
Yeah.
essentially. Yeah.
Uh, and the majority view has been to kind of evaluate and say, okay, is this illegal behavior? So things like kidnapping, coercion, extortion, any type of high pressure situation, especially of like non-student members, uh, or harassment, those kinds of behaviors are illegal. And, some of them are even to the point of hazing. And those get, the non-student members at least banned, and some of the organizations have been outright banned by campuses. So, for example, one particularly known Ivy League school noticed over, I think it was like a 5 or 6 year point in time, they looked at members, they looked at their grades. I experienced this. My grades dropped as I was a member.
Right.
They saw them taking longer to graduate. They saw them either dropping out or switching into easier majors. And they said, this is against the academic charter of our church, or of our school, sorry, not
Right.
church, of our school. And we have to ban this group. This is not acceptable. We cannot approve of this behavior, or, this group and how they're conducting themselves.
Yep.
Some groups have been banned because of these things, over the illegal behavior, over the, uh, you know, basically doing things that are against the academic charter of the school.
Yeah, I remember Boston University outright banned the Boston Church of Christ. They were, because the members were so pressured to recruit new people all the time. that they were needing to report results. So people would be going into dorms and harassing people, etc. But I have another angle on this, which is families who are paying for their children to attend college.
Yep.
A threat of a lawsuit that the campus administration is allowing them to exist on campus without like warning freshmen and transfer students. There are people operating on our campus that are not necessarily, kosher, and, go to this resource office or here's websites. And even there was a period of time where they would bring in former members like yourself or myself to give orientations to freshmen and transfer students. For me, that's a much healthier, proactive kind of thing, as opposed to just saying this group's off campus, because as we discussed, they can also have different friend groups and operate under different names, and you can play
Absolutely.
that game for years. But overall, if administrations understand educating their students how to discern unethical influence versus ethical influence, is going to empower them for the rest of their lives.
Absolutely. I mean, certainly, kind of two thoughts on that. One is like, it was in 1997, and I was recruited by three different cultic groups. One was Amway, one was the Church of Scientology, one was the local church. And
Amway is a multi-level marketing group, and there are many of those
yeah.
operating still.
And prior to that point in time, I had some hesitation. I was like, well, what if I get sucked into church again, or some kind of cult group? And I realized that I had learned enough, studying psychology, studying Lifton's criteria, for example, to be able to examine the symptoms. You never go up to a cult member and say, hey, are you part of a cult? And they're not going to be honest with you. They're not going to say, of course I'm not. What are you talking about?
Although some cults are saying, yep, of course we're in a cult, and they make a joke out of it. That's
Right.
another little.
Yeah, they diffuse it that way.
Yeah, but go on.
But what you can tell are the symptoms, and as you were saying, the discernment of trying to figure out, like, do they use jargon? Do they, basically, as everything much more black and white than we find in the world? Is everything reductionistic? Is the church's doctrine or the group's doctrine like the overarching theme to everything? And they tell you what you should believe, and how are ex-members treated? Are they treated as nobodies, and or are they, is there legitimacy of what they say?
Yeah,
And
exactly. I just finished my doctoral dissertation, and I did my a quantitative study on over 1,000 people on the byte model of
yep,
mind control. So looking at behavior, information, thought, and emotional control.
yep,
And what I came up with was all four are comprise what I now refer to as authoritarian control. So I've shifted from calling it the byte model of mind control to the byte model of authoritarian control, because it really lines up with blind submission to an authority,
yep,
suppression of your own individual will, and your own ability to think for yourself. And I think it really fits.
absolutely,
And if something's legitimate, it will stand up to scrutiny.
absolutely.
And
And
informed consent is not a single time thing. It's an ongoing process. So you can be in a group for years, but the group can change in a negative direction, and it appears more subtle. But the bottom line is you always have the right to question the authority figures, ask where the money's going, ask, is there secret doctrines that are not being shared with the public? Very concrete, specific things. As we wrap up, Chris, I want to thank you for taking this time. Any last words of wisdom or recommendations if somebody has a family member or friend in one of these groups, or if someone is in a group and they've been having questions? What would
yeah,
you?
certainly it's different advice that I'd have, obviously. For the friends or family members, you never want to outright say, like, hey, I need you to read this literature about the cult that you're in, that kind of grabs them the wrong way. Kind of what you want to do is educate yourself to understand, and bit by
Right,
bit, it may be overwhelming at first, so you kind of want to pace yourself.
right.
You educate yourself to understand what they're in and what are the forces in play, what are the beliefs, and then usually I find something like the strategic interaction model, like asking lots of questions. Anytime you think you're going to make an assertion, like a declaration or a sentence, turn it into a question. Is that normal? Is that unusual? Why do you think these things? Um,
Yeah, and ask the question in a non-judgmental tone and give a long silence. Let them think about it. Don't rush off to another question and
yeah,
such.
and certainly file it for later. Keep a mental chalkboard of
Yep,
everything that they say, and even if you don't address it now, as I always say, like, you don't have to fight every battle every day.
right.
The wise man picks and chooses his battles, and you want to fight battles you can win. You don't want to like fight battles that you're just going to die on every hill and
Yeah, and you want to stay in touch with people, especially family members and friends. So, sticking with common ground where you can agree on
yep,
if you like sports or if you like to go fishing together to, keep those activities going to be in the person's life, because the more contact they have with non-cult members, the closer they're going to be able to reality
yep,
test
yep.
and such.
And
Um,
maybe the last thought for you, which is like the members, I would say, you know, write down those hard questions that you have and ask them, see what the reaction is, and also try to really, don't settle for hand waving and whatever else, but really, ask where the money is going, ask who's at the top, who makes decisions and how are things done. Um, you know,
I wouldn't just ask where the money, you'd want to see the books. That's what they'll always say. Oh, yeah, we can arrange that later. And it's like, okay, when? I want to see the accounting records. Because the legitimate groups will be like, sure.
yep.
And the illegitimate ones will be making excuses and finding a reason to make you feel bad that you're asking for it.
And even, don't be afraid to say, I'm not fully confident that this is a mission or a group that I can support, so I'd like to know more before I give, of not only my money but my time, and kind of like, really investigate the causes that you're investing yourself into, and say, okay, I'm going to do some research before I want to join or fully commit to this.
Great.
And ask people like, you and me and other experts, or even like ask a legitimate pastor or staff workers
Well,
and
you
get.
are a legitimate pastor, now that I found that out. And reveal.org is the website you put together. A lot of good videos on it, a lot of, testimonials of
Yep.
former members and such. And with the pandemic, with the economy, I just see an explosion of cult recruitment happening. And people are isolated, they're uncertain, they're fearful. And there's all this data mining that's been done on people and targeting to try to get them watching certain videos that is part of a regime to actually recruit and indoctrinate them online. I know that I've done research on QAnon, for example, and there's a whole area where they're recruiting Christians and people in Christian-esque cults into QAnon. It's really disturbing.
Hmm, that is disturbing.
Yeah. So I want to thank you very much for taking the time,
You're welcome.
and
Thank you.
we'll do a blog and people can reach out to you, I assume.
Sure,
Um,
absolutely.
thank you so much.